So this is a session that's badged for single hazards, but we've been a little bit more flexible on that because often as not, natural hazards that are badged as a single hazard, in fact, are a cast of other hazards, each of which needs a slightly different approach in the design and the delivery of the warnings that are involved. And volcanoes are particularly good example of this. And indeed, we are very fortunate to have a particularly expert panel to illustrate this all to you. Oh, and in the order. Wow, this is talk about self-organization. This is terrific. So, just briefly, this from left to right is Carmen Solano, who is Associate Professor of Volcanology Risk Communication at the University of Portsmouth. Liz Gaunt, who is a NERC Independent Research Fellow at Earth Sciences at University College London. Francis Beckett, who manages the team responsible for providing information about volcanic ash at the Met Office, and Amy Donovan at the far end there, who is the new Professor for Environmental Geography at the University of Cambridge. So, and they will give you more about their backgrounds individually. But one of the key linking features of all our experts is that they all have practical experience of dealing with emergencies. It's not just academic research. So we're particularly keen on this feature that's learning how to translate what would seem to be rather esoteric knowledge into something that is useful for protecting communities. We have two conveners. The main one is Emma Nicholson, who's a volcanologist with us at UCL, and I myself, I'm the token man, and so yeah, and I also work on volcanoes, particularly forecasting eruptions, both with a history of working at various volcano observatories as well as at UCL. Now, if everything goes according to plan, the session will run something like this. We're going to, each of the panelists has a short introductory talk to make certain particular points, and we decided we'd do sessions of 2 speakers, then questions, immediate questions for those 2 speakers, then the following 2 speakers and immediate questions, and then we'll round up the session by an open discussion about everything that we've talked about for the whole morning. Does that sound straightforward? Okay. Oh, the other thing was audience participation. So does that sound straightforward? Yeah. Lovely. Brilliant. We did have a warm-up act, but he failed to arrive. So anyway, so before I just hand over to the panel, I'd like to, for those of you who perhaps are less familiar with volcanoes, just give you about 3 or 4 minutes of sort of general context of why our topic is of particular interest in designing warnings. Why are we interested? Why volcanoes, apart from the splendor that they present? In terms of warnings, there's a problem with their behavior that covers that presents an extreme range of different types of hazards. Impact can be very localized within a few kilometers. It can be international across hundreds of kilometers distance. They can affect you on the ground, in the air, even underwater. And according to the type of behavior that's involved, we have different timescales for the warnings, how long you have to deliver the warning, and also to then promote a response. And the stakeholders that are involved also change according to the type of hazard that we're dealing with. It's not, of course, there are the communities living around the volcano, but there are then, we have international implications as well, as the panel will point out to you. And so, in the end, the sort of questions that we're interested in asking is, who are the warnings for? Because there's a range of stakeholders. What should the warnings say? So we have to perhaps cater the warning for the people that we're talking to. What are their needs? and what are the actions we would hope would be a consequence of delivering the warning. And again, how we develop the warning, what is the purpose? And this is one possible scheme, and this is open to debate, but we could argue that as we approach the moment of crisis, the object of an exercise changes slightly from giving information and advising people that the volcano is being monitored to giving instruction that, well, actually it's time to move away if that's the appropriate response. But again, I think we'll have different examples being described with us later on this morning. But finally, I think one of the things that we're particularly interested in, given that this is a conference on warnings for all, we'd like to share the lessons, the panel would like to share the lessons that they have learnt, but we'd be very interested to find out first if you, especially if you've come from different fields, can offer information that will be useful to help us learn more. But equally, we'd be interested to know if there are any things that the panel have suggested that could in turn be useful to you in your separate fields, if it's not beyond just volcanoes. So we're trying to sort of broaden the scope of the application of our experience to natural hazards in general. And I think with that, I can hope that provides just a very short introduction of the sorts of topics that the chair will be covering. And with that, then, I would like to, oh no, that's just some chap on the, next to a lava flow on Etna. There's some holding slides there in case. Fine. We'd like to pass the discussion straight away, please, to our first speaker. That's Dr. Carmen Solana. Micah, there you go. You have a choice. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it's going to be easier standing here. I'm going to move this towards the rest of the people of the panel so they can see a little bit what am I referring to. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here today. And as Chris has said, I'm a volcanologist, and I'm also someone that works in risk communication, and some of you might have wondered why. And I know this is not meant to be a super formal session, it's more like to share experiences. So I will start just saying that when I started my career as a volcanologist, I thought what I needed to do is find more information, more precise information. But with the years and with experience, I realized that it's probably more important the communication, the good relationship between the people that are going to be the stakeholders during a volcanic eruption. And this relationship of trust, of knowing each other, and of needs from the public, which I believe, although Chris was showing who is this for, to me the ultimate stakeholder is the public, is the people that are going to be affected. So with that in mind, I'm going to be today discussing very, very roughly the sort of the journey that some of the volcanic advice is going to be taking or could potentially take. This I'm showing is very, very simplistic, and it will vary between cases. But I think what I would like to discuss is not these aspects, but what can be an obstacle, what challenges we encounter in this sort of potentially very simple, obvious chain of actions. And it starts with a volcano, and I'm going to start in the spirit of the session, which is about hazards that maybe they're not frequent. I'm going to talk about the case of a volcano that might not have erupted in generations, so there is inexperience. So that inexperience is not on the public, it's also in the scientists that are going to be having to produce interpretations and forecasts. It's in the officials that are going to have to make decisions, and in general in how to communicate between each other. So the signals from a volcano are in theory, they're always going to be received first by instruments, but in reality, sometimes are not going to be received by instruments. They're going to be felt by people. So this is going to change the whole dynamics. So this already doesn't work as it shows because of the signals received and interpretation, forecast, warning. Public is going to start saying, oh, we feel something, what's going on? And some of this is going to have to be sped up very very quickly. So I'm going to go into the much easier case of a volcano that starts showing some signals that are received by instruments. And what happens typically is that the scientists are going to be watching these signals before doing anything because of, is this something is really is going to develop into an eruption, or is this just one of these freaks clusters of shakings or of gases or something that might happen and disappear and nothing happens. So they're not going to, typically they're not going to be warning anybody, talking to anybody, informing anybody. They're going to wait, and that's the first sort of delay, just what's going on. And as things start becoming clear or a little bit more persistent, probably we're going to start, or scientists are going to try to interpret that signals. And in an ideal world, this is like in an observatory or some official body that will have a model that will give you a solution. But in the real world, you don't only have one official outlet. You have universities working in volcanoes that they have their own models, their own ways of interpreting that data. You're going to have even individuals that they have their own models, and they're going to be trying to produce the next step of the information. And the official, say, observatory or monitoring station is going to liaise sometimes with some of these partners and their models. They might not have their own model. So there's going to be a delay in there as well, because if they have to decide what of the interpretations, all the possible options are they going to be picking in order to produce a forecast. And that forecast is going to require the agreement, even within an institution. It's very likely, and I have seen in very many occasions, that different people of the team have different ideas of what the forecast should be. So they're going to be different, and they have to come to an agreement. And how to come to an agreement is already on its own a very difficult process that is going to take time. In between that interpretation, of course, the second step, the official monitoring station is going to let the officials, the people that will be making decisions, know about this unrest. So they, on their own, are going to have to be starting to be prepared. But when we're talking about something that has never happened, this is very difficult. It's very frightening. Nobody wants to have to respond to something they don't exactly know what it is about. So that on its own is going to create delays. At the same time that the scientists are doing all of this, the civil authorities are going to be talking between themselves and saying, what do we do? Do we have plans? Do we have, different alert systems? And normally there's going to be also a lag of time, just sort of to realize what's going on. So once this forecast has been given to the authorities, and it might be not one, but eventually you might have to keep giving these forecasts. It's on the hands of the authorities to go into the public. There is, for those of you that are not volcanologists, there is like a code of conduct that we all try to follow to an extent, in which you do not speak to anybody. You do not disseminate your ideas of how the crisis is going to evolve, but you just, you let the officials make the decision, whether you think they're right or they're wrong. And sometimes the dilemma of just thinking they're doing something wrong, but I cannot say anything, is quite of an important one. It's a personal one, an ethical dilemma. And then the authorities, sometimes they're going to have to produce a warning, but once they have a warning, they're going to have to recommend actions and reactions. And there are also quite a lot of delays happening. and conflicting information and correct and incorrect, and the public that, under my point of view, is the ultimate, the final stakeholder. They're going to be wondering what's going on. So I'm going to give you an example of something I did that maybe I shouldn't have done, which is I actually spoke before I should have, and before the official, the officials had produced their warning. And I'm going to show you why. And this was during La Palma in 2021. So I am from the Canary Islands. I'm a volcanologist. I'm a local, but I work in the UK. I'm not part of any of the official monitoring groups. And the people, some people I know, some of my family were asking, what's going on? What can be done? What can we do? And that's a dilemma. What do I say? I cannot tell you until officially you get the answer. Would you say that to your cousin? And that's one of the things I want to put to you, to the public, the type of dilemmas that sometimes some scientists are going to be facing, because in the ideal world, it follows that line, but the world is not ideal. So I went on and I did say, actually, it looks like we're coming towards an eruption. This is the type of eruption is more likely under my point of view. And, these are the different hazards that are more likely to happen. And this is how they behave. So the lava flows move at this speed, so you can walk away from them, so you shouldn't be scared. Watch what the authorities are going to be telling you. They will be organizing something for you. All of this is going on in the background, because the authorities they had the warning, they had the forecast, but it stopped in there. They were just doing things on the background that the public couldn't see. And in fact, the eruption started when the alert was still at yellow, at watch. It wasn't even at red, at the eruption is starting. And as it happens, one scientist at some point of the official monitoring, at some point, did say that the warning had been given before the eruption. And she had to retract, because of the authorities didn't like very much the fact that she actually said exactly what happened. So there are all sorts of dilemmas, there's all sorts of other interests, etc., that go on, that make all this process quite difficult. But there is also some solutions, and I believe some of the other speakers might be either posing these questions to you or also offering probably a bit more positive experiences. La Palma at the end was a success in the sense that nobody really died. So, so it wasn't like a case in which, people were really threatened and a lot of people died. But still, it just comes to illustrate that when there is inexperience, there are lots of delays, and the public, they are waiting for the scientists. They're all looking at the scientists. And the scientists sometimes cannot, they don't have the freedom that everybody thinks scientists have, or they may have, maybe they should have it. So that's all, that's my part. Thank you very much, and I get back into...
Bill aside. Okay, good morning everyone. It's really great to be here. So my name's Liz Gaughan, and I am now back at UCL as a NERC Independent Research Fellow, but I've just spent the best part of the last decade in Ecuador working in the Geophysics Institute, which is the earthquake and volcanic monitoring organization in Ecuador. And I'm going to kind of follow on a little bit from Carmen on the topic of trust as probably one of the most important things that is required when giving early warnings and in science communication. And I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit about a success story, or at least a success in the end, based on Tunguaral volcano in Ecuador. So Tunguaral volcano, you can see a map there in the middle. It's a very big stratovolcano, a very dangerous volcano, and has lots of population around it, and began erupting in 1999. And when it began erupting, there were official evacuations put in place. People were removed from the local area. And in the end, this actually turned out to be a problem because the National Risk Management people, basically the equivalent of civil defence, decided that they were going to keep people away from their homes for months. And this really soured the population against the decision made. They thought actually this was the scientists keeping them away from their homes. And it actually turned violent in the end, and people forcefully went back to their homes. Even though the volcano was still erupting and still not causing an actual problem for the people at the time, but it definitely had the potential to do so. And so one of the things the scientists at the Geophysics Institute did was decided that they wanted to establish a monitoring site closer to the volcano. And so they set up a field site, which you can actually see in these pictures. So this was basically 2 rooms on a chicken farm that was lent to us by a local family in the area. And you can see in the top map, the little black diamond that says OBT next to it. That's the Tungurahua Observatory. So it's located about 13 kilometers from the summit. But what that meant is that the scientists were actually in the local area on the ground with the people, able to respond to media requests, able to respond to the National Risk Management, Civil Defence people, and able to actually be there with the locals. And because of these mandatory evacuations which went sour, trust was completely broken between the public and scientists and civil defence. And so one thing that was needed was basically to rebuild that trust. And so one of the things that was done was the Vigias network was set up. So Vigía literally means watchman in Spanish. So one of the things that they set in place for people to return to their homes were that there would be a group of people who were the leaders of their community. So these are very small villages around this volcano. We're not talking about big cities here. And they very much have a family structure with a community leader. And so these community leaders were established as the Vigias. And they were part of an official network that were providing information not only to scientists, but to civil defence, to the National Risk Management Secretary. And this line of communication, you can see, went in both directions. So the Vigias provided information to the scientists about the volcano, things they observed on the volcano. And in return, the observatory provided information directly back to the Vigias, to the local communities. So the information that was coming from the observatory and from the scientists was going directly back into the community. Now, we're not talking about official evacuation orders, we're talking about just general information about the volcano. So if we would see an increase in seismic activity on the volcano, a radio call would be put out to the Vigias and they would be informed that activity was increasing. And over time, this network of Vigias grew. So you can see all the triangles that are dotted around the volcano are locations where Vigias were in place and were actively reporting back to both the observatory and civil defence. And you can actually see in the top right corner, one of the original Vigias, who is still a Vigia to this day, Carlos Sanchez. He's actually become a world famous now since the BBC did a little segment on him. And eventually what happened was these became paid positions for the Vigias. So the observatory would have monitoring equipment on their land, and they would pay them a small fee to keep the monitoring equipment on their land and also to do maintenance for us. So they actually provided a really great service to the scientists who were not able to get around onto the volcano at all times. And slowly but surely, more and more Vigias were set up. And that trust between the scientists having somebody with direct communication in the local community, that trust in the scientists slowly began to build back up to the point where instead of being viewed as kind of the enemy, you're keeping us away from our homes, even though nothing's actually going to happen to us, they became proud to be associated as a Vigia. They had sweatshirts and caps that they used to wear that had the logos on their backs. And people became really proud then to be associated with the monitoring organization and to be known as a Vigia. And so that trust, up until the Tongariro Observatory was shut down in 2018, because Tongariro decided to stop erupting. And so this actually no longer exists, sadly. But the Vihirs network is still there. The Vihirs network is still active. They still all have their radios. If in the event in the future Tongariro becomes active again, they are available in the future, and they still communicate with the observatory scientists. And so this is probably a really nice success story about how something that went wrong in the beginning, trust was built back up, and actually then the communication between the scientists and the civil defense was at a stage where it was efficient and people knew what was happening. The Vihirs were actually provided with official training, so they actually knew how to scientifically report observations to us. And by the last eruptive phase in 2016 that Tongariro had, the people living around the volcano understood enough the science that the observatory was communicating to them that they would evacuate themselves without official evacuation orders being given. So if they could see that activity was increasing, they would go and sleep somewhere else for the night to make sure that they were out of the way during the night, for example, if anything was to happen, and then they would come back during the day. So all the tensions from the beginning of the eruption had been dissipated to the point where people were willingly leaving their homes to keep themselves safe, because the flow of information was there throughout all of the activity. They were not surprised where nobody was saying anything to them, and then all of a sudden they were saying, it's too dangerous, you have to leave. They were part of the whole process, and then when it came time to leave, they were happy to do so. This has been tried at other volcanoes in Ecuador and has not been as successful, I think, for a number of reasons. That a lot of the other volcanoes that it's been tried on, they're big cities as opposed to small farming communities that are around them. So this is definitely not a solution for a global scale. And I think in that respect, the takeaway parts of this is building trust with your communities is probably one of the biggest things that you need to do. They need to trust that what you're saying is actually true, and there are a number of things that we might come on to later which can break that trust. And one of the biggest things actually for them was seeing the scientists on the ground. What they didn't like was having somebody miles away, out of danger, telling them what was happening and what was going on and that they needed to leave. Actually seeing the scientists on the ground with them was a massive part of building that trust and seeing them there. So yeah, that's more of just a little success story. And actually, from what Carmen said, this was a case where the science was directly communicated to the public by the scientists. Now, in saying that, the information that was given to the public, there were no interpretations. It was direct information from the volcano. Seismicity is increasing, seismicity is decreasing. We're seeing explosions, we're not seeing explosions. The scientists never put out, we think something massive is going to happen in the future, you need to leave. It was just the information that the volcano was providing. And they learned over time, over the 17 years that this volcano was threatening them, how to interpret what the volcano was doing by looking at it and by listening to the information that was being provided by the scientists.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Carmen. Okay, so we're going to have a brief discussion session based on what we've heard this morning. So opening, I can see hands straight up, opening questions up to the floor and also to those online. So please just give me a raise if you see a question online as well. Anyone would like to start?
Okay. Hi, thanks. Andrew Tupper, volcanic friendly meteorologist. I thank you for both of those talks. What strikes me is volcanologists have to put up with an awful lot in trying to manage through an event. And as a meteorologist, I kind of feel a bit guilty about that, because I can't think of a country that I've been to where, you know, both sets of hazards exist and where the volcanologists have got better resourcing or better legislation or better relationships with emergency services than the Met community. And and there are reasons for that, but a lot of that is the sort of the global push for establishing legislation from WMO and best practices and so on, and things that are really rolled out. And also that met hazards tend to be a bit easier in terms of the forecasting element and the ability to sort of point to something that happened 5 minutes ago rather than 5,000 years ago. I think that we need to greatly improve the way that we deal with this in terms of early warnings for all, and really work out where the gaps are for not just volcanoes, but for the other hazards that are neglected in the international frameworks, where we need to accelerate progress before we get a really scaled up disaster. Do you agree? Do you have any comments on that?
My name is Olaf Neusner. I'm an independent consultant. I have a question concerning the ambiguous or difficult decision making, because as far as I know, there is a relatively established warning system for airplanes. Where I would expect that some standards are existing where you know when to warn or when not to warn, and so that is it for this particular aspect of warning, is it also so difficult, or that you don't know yes or no, or you look some okay.
There is a talk after this break precisely about that,
Okay,
so I will hold your question until
Okay.
that's fine.
Yeah, I just might add a little bit to that. Is I think there's a definite difference between when you're providing warnings, for example, for ash in the atmosphere versus when you're providing warnings to people on the ground who are actually kind of in a much more imminent danger from the volcano. Observatories will have levels of activity in the different parameters and the different monitoring parameters, which might suggest different things about that volcano or what might happen, but there is never a certainty. The volcano never does what you expect it to do, basically. So it's you can set levels and you can set actions based on those levels, but you would never expect the volcano to follow exactly what the framework that you set out, basically.
Yeah, and in answering to the first question, I agree completely that a framework, better frameworks are very much needed. I always thought that with meteorology, it's not that it's easier, is that people can see they can actually see it themselves in all the charts. This is something they're exposed continuously with, weather forecasting, and somehow that trust has been developed with virtually all cultures. They know what the weather forecast is. And there is an expectation, probably a much more realistic expectation from meteorological scientists than from maybe volcanologists or seismic. We just have been through a very damaging earthquake, and they keep asking, could the scientists have done something? Could they have, predicted this? While somehow, I don't know to what extent they're asking the same about the floods, also more destructive floods that have also occurred. And I wonder if there is also a component of being able to, first, as you said, much better frameworks and much more established and probably much more funded, developed, whatever, but also that the geophysical hazards are not necessarily obvious to the site, and they're more difficult for people to get a feel of what you mean, what's happening, and how things can change. I don't know, that's my personal opinion.
A question for you both then is, how do you feel, if at all, should the content of a warning or the style in which it's communicated vary depending on whether the public or the impacted group can feel or see the signals versus when they cannot? I know you touched on that, Carmen, in your talk. Do either of you have any comments on that?
So Yeah, I think it changes very much. I think people, first of all, pay much more attention when they actually personalize it. I felt this, so therefore I'm being affected, and that's really important. When it is something abstract that could or could not happen, not everybody pays attention, and especially as this session is about inexperience, so hazards that they haven't been facing previously, they might have either a complete feeling that that's not going to happen to them, or maybe they have heard all these stories about huge explosions. And I, being from the Canary Islands, I remember all the rumors, and now I find it amusing, but rumors that since I was little, that the islands were connected underneath, that there was a big, like say there was a time bomb, and you don't know when you're actually facing an emergency, all these rumors come back, and you have heard them for many years, and you wonder what's true and what is not. So yeah, I think first of all, you pay more attention, and you're more interested when you think it's going to actually affect you, and that's a window of opportunity to sometimes push a message instead of keeping quiet or silent because you haven't organized exactly what the next steps will be, so you don't want to let a lot go. I think I believe transparency, and as Liz was saying, involvement with the communities and trust is very important. I suspect that's why they were asking me, oh, what's going on? Can you help me? Can you tell us? Because you're part of the community, like the Vigias to an extent, and that made you more credible than sometimes the people that weren't saying anything, or they were working. I know they were working much harder than me with all the crisis, but they couldn't let a lot out.
I think one thing I'd probably add to that is that as the scientists giving the warnings, I think sometimes we sort of underestimate the things that people might see and how they might interpret them. So for example, if some of the volcanoes that I was dealing with in Ecuador had slightly bigger steam plumes one day, we'd kind of look at that and go, oh, that's fairly normal, we don't really care about that. And yet we'd be getting panicked phone calls from the public being, what's happening? Why is the gas coming out of the volcano? This is different, this is new, what should we do? And so I think as scientists, we need to be a little bit more aware of the fact that what we perceive as a threat is not necessarily what the public perceives as a threat, and probably need to work a lot better to actually explain even the smaller phenomenon and the smaller things that are going on, even if it's just to kind of debunk the fact that this is fine, there's nothing happening, but that perception of what we see as a danger versus what the public sees as a danger is probably very different.
And also what they're watching for, because sometimes there will be like a beautiful sunset in Canaries, and they say, oh, is that because of there's going to be an eruption? And you thought, no, it's just a beautiful sunset. No.
Okay.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentation. I had a question about this particular setup and how you withdrew, because this is something that we do a lot of sort of pilot projects within the Met community, and actually the leaving part is really difficult, and how to, do that communication of we're going to withdraw now. You have the capacity to continue, in your current setup, or, how is that going to be sustained into the future? And there's often a lot of questions about, well, where's the data going to come from? How are we going to still be paid in some circumstances? So I'd be really interested to learn from you guys in terms of how you do that extraction process when you kind of go, okay, the volcano's gone down now, we don't need to worry about it, but you guys still live there,
So yeah, that was, I think one thing to explain here is that the Tungarao Observatory, it was a branch of the main observatory, which was in Quito. So all of the monitoring, all of the monitoring for all of the volcanoes in Ecuador is done from the main base in Quito. And all of the data, even from Tungarao, still went to Quito, as well as the Tungarao Observatory. The observatory was literally just a place that we would have two scientists go and do shifts to have people on site. When we did the removal of OVT, it was sadly financially motivated, because when the volcano stopped erupting, there was the kind of university said, why are we still paying people to go there if there's no real need for them to be there? But actually it didn't change a huge amount, because all of the monitoring was still being done in Quito. So nothing has changed in terms of the monitoring. It's just that there are not 2 people sat in the observatory all of the time. And so that aspect of it has not changed. The Vihias network, for example, still exists. They still have their radios, and they're still contacted when things, because the volcano, even though it's not actively erupting, it's still an active volcano. And so there are still manifestations that you see on the surface. And so we still speak to the Vihias that provided a service like looking after equipment or having equipment on their land, are still visited regularly by the maintenance teams. They're still paid by the observatory to have the equipment on their land. So actually the only thing that changed was there were not 2 people on the chicken farm. Basically everything else remained essentially the same, apart from the communication is not constant now, because there's no need, because the volcano is not actively erupting.
It's interesting to hear actually the point around how you're maintaining the relationship with the Vihias, because arguably you want that to be at its strongest ahead of a future crisis, rather than having to then redevelop that in the moment. So you basically answered my next question. Okay, we have another question from the floor.
Thank you very much for both your talks. They're really great. I just wanted to touch on the uncertainty point. And I was wondering, to what extent do you want to communicate that uncertainty of an eruption to the public without reducing the kind of severity or urgency of a warning of the hazard? And how is that uncertainty communicated?
Who would like to take
That's actually a really good question, and it's probably a very difficult thing to answer, and I would probably be only answering for how the IG deals with it. And basically there is no way to be certain. Even when you're dealing with massive data streams coming off these volcanoes, there is no way to be certain about what the volcano is going to do. And you do want the general public to understand that fact. They may not understand that fact, and I think majority of the time they don't understand that fact, and they don't like the fact that you cannot say, yes, this is going to happen, or no, this is not going to happen. This is a real problem. But we would be really irresponsible as monitoring scientists if we did try and say, we know this is going to happen, or we know this is not going to happen. And so there is definitely a really fine balance of saying, okay, this is a high probability scenario, this is a low probability scenario, but we cannot guarantee or not guarantee either of those. This is the information that we think is the most relevant at this time. This may change, this will change, because we will get more information, we will get, changes in what's happening on the volcano. And you can't please everybody. No matter what you tell the public, they're not going to like what you say, because you're not going to be saying exactly what they want to hear, essentially. But there is that fine balance of keeping them up to date, but having them still realize that this is not a certainty. So yeah, I would say that there is no specific answer to your question, sadly, and I think there won't be for a very long time, I'm afraid. And you can never please everybody. You can never tell everybody what they want to hear, essentially. And the public, I think, even though they would say they didn't, they do have preconceived notions about what they want to hear. They want to be told they're safe, or they want to be told they're not safe and they have to leave. And actually, in reality, it's not physically possible to do that.
I agree completely. And I think to an extent, transparency is the answer. So the more you just say, look, these are the scenarios we're looking at, we think this is much more likely with the data we have, this is less. There is this preconception that the public is going to panic, or you're going to lose face and they're going to think that you're useless if you don't have one scenario to show. And I don't think it's true. I think there's much more understanding and much more flexibility on people when you're transparent with them. And I think we probably should debunk all these fake ideas of what the public will do. We're all the public. Would you do that? Probably not. So why would other people do it? Why are they that different to you? And that's one of the aspects I always ask myself. Would my mom do that? Would my brother do that? No. And my friends. So why do they think people are going to run around with their hands up in the air? So transparently, I will say.
I was just going to make one last comment to that. Some of the experiences I've had with people actually is that in the public, when trying to tell them actually that this maybe is a bit of a not great situation, is they tend to completely dismiss it. They tend to be like, well, no, we're fine. I think we'll just stay where we are. So I think actually sometimes it goes completely in the opposite direction, where you're trying to say, look, this might not be the greatest situation. And they're like, no, we've been here forever. It's fine. And that can happen. So.
Yeah, we do have time for one more question and then we'll pass on.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sally Potter from New Zealand at the Geoscience Observatory there. Just thought I'd share our experience with communicating uncertainty there, if that's okay. There's an example where we had Taupo supervolcano start having unrest last year and into this year. And so we had to communicate the fact that it was having unrest, and it was the very first time we'd raised the alert level from 0 to 1 there, and we were worried about the public response and economic impacts and all these kind of things. So we knew we had to communicate the uncertainty of what was going on. So the ways that we did that was, first of all, compare the current unrest episode to all the ones that had happened in the past, and that showed the number that had occurred but not erupted. So that was kind of one slightly different way to how we'd usually think about communicating uncertainty. The other one was that we communicated to the stakeholders in government and the local councils and the local Indigenous population the different scenarios of what might occur. And we had 6 scenarios going forward from that minor unrest state. And we had probabilities associated with each of them. And we used ranges in those uncertainties. And we had various new ways of trying to communicate those ranges and differences over time and how they evolved. But some of the ranges were huge, like absolutely massive, to the point where there's hesitancy to communicate at all. But we did it, and it received really good feedback. So we're exploring new ways, basically, of trying to get around that uncertainty.
Thanks a lot, Sally. Just to finish off with you guys, one more question, and the spirit of trying to think about how we can take this single hazard and translate it to other hazards, particularly regarding the Bahia's approach. How do you think that could apply to other natural hazards apart from volcanology?
That is a very interesting question, and I think it would be possible. I think it depends on the type of hazard. So volcanoes are obviously a big thing that is there. It doesn't move. It's never going to move. It's always going to erupt for the most part. And so you can see it. And so there are things to report on. When there are hazards like earthquakes, your information is coming afterwards, essentially. If you have Bahias on earthquakes, you generally won't get information beforehand. And so in that respect, it's probably not quite as useful. With meteorological type hazards, again, I suppose it depends what, the area you're in and what can be seen. I think the Bahias is definitely something of this is an observational type thing. So if you can't see the hazard coming, it's probably not as useful. But where it would potentially be useful is that link to the community and that trust between the community and the scientists, that when the scientists say something is about to happen, the people listen to it.
I think that could probably be translated for landslides as well, having people watching how they're moving, and also for floods. I can imagine that if you involve a certain person or key people on the communities for watching how the rivers are behaving or they're responding, and you have continuous communication with that individual that have a network with the locals, that could also work very well. And I'm sure in the world they have those sort of systems already in place.
All right, thank you both. So we will move to the second half of the session. Which of you are speaking first? I forget. I'll introduce Francis Beckett from the UK Met Office. And there we go.
So hello everybody, thank you for joining us in this session. So I'm Frances, I often go by Frankie, and I lead a small team of researchers at the Met Office in developing our atmospheric dispersion modelling capability, and specifically we have a focus on supporting the modelling system used by the London Volcanic Ash Advisory Centre. So I just wanted to spend a few moments now thinking about some perspectives from the development and issuance of volcanic ash cloud forecasts. I'm going to provide a little bit of background, and then I have a final slide with a list of thoughts, questions, discussion points, hopefully some interesting things to think about. So volcanic ash cloud forecasts are delivered by a network of 9 volcanic ash advisory centres, referred to as VACs, and their areas of responsibility cover the global airspace. And their role is to provide advice and guidance to the aviation industry to support their decisions as to whether it's safe for aircraft to fly. Many of the VACs are coupled to a Met service, and you'll see in a minute why that might be. And the Met Office in the UK is the home of the London VAC. So currently, our products are in 2 forms. So firstly, we provide a volcanic ash graphic, which indicates the expected location of the ash cloud up to 18 hours ahead. And we have an example of one of those on the left-hand side here. And then in Europe, we also currently provide these supplementary ash concentration charts, which indicate how much ash we think there might be. It's probably fair to say that the exact process and procedure at each VAC is bespoke, and I guess my perspective is there are some good reasons for that. We're all responding to different types of events, we have different frequency of events, we have different levels of observations, but there are some common elements. So firstly, we all use atmospheric dispersion models to simulate the onwards transport of the ash cloud. And these are driven by 4-dimensional meteorological fields, in other words, the weather forecast. And they also need to be initialized by some information about the source of the ash into the atmosphere, the release. We often refer to these as eruption source parameters. So we want to know where ash is being released, which volcanoes are erupting. We want to know the height over which it's being released into the atmosphere, and we want to know how much is being released. I also just wanted to comment about the role of the human here in the process. So at the Met Office, the London VAC is staffed by a group of operational meteorologists who provide a 24/7 service. And they play a pivotal role in bringing together all of this information to provide the best possible forecast. So obviously we continuously strive to improve our forecasts, and I wanted to just comment on some of the drivers of change. So many of us here are scientists, and obviously we are constantly seeking to improve our understanding of the behavior of ash clouds and our ability, in our case, to be able to model and simulate them. But for an operational system, what's also very important is our technological advances too. So it doesn't matter how wonderful and new and shiny our new bit of science is, if it's really computationally inefficient, we're not going to be able to pull it through to our operational service. So the role of the software engineer is becoming increasingly important so that we can do our science quickly. We are obviously influenced by events, and probably one of the more well-known examples is, of course, the eruption of Nicholson in Iceland in 2010, which, partly due to its longevity, led to significant disruption to aviation in Europe, and also changes to our forecasting process and products during the event. And then lastly, I wanted to comment on how we are continuously improving our understanding of the impacts too. So for us, a good example is our improving understanding of the tolerance of modern jet engines to volcanic ash. And then pulling all of this information together, we then end up with changes to the recommended practices. So for example, an example at the moment is that the International Civil Aviation Organization is asking us to think about probabilistic forecasts in the future. So that was just a really quick overview of some of the concepts and things that we're interested in. But I wanted to now go through a few perspectives and perhaps some discussion items that we can all perhaps debate. So the first point here is knowledge exchange is key. So perhaps obvious point is that of course we need to make sure that our stakeholders, our customers in our case, understand the information that we're giving them. And that the information that we're giving them is actually what they need. Well, the other point I wanted to make here that I think is really important is that it's also important to make sure that as experts and collaborators, we also understand each other's roles and the information that we're providing. And we've been really thinking about this recently, so we call it in peacetime, really building those collaborations and sharing knowledge with other experts in our field that we're going to be working with during the event, so that they can really understand why we're doing something a certain way before the emergency happens. And we've been finding that using exercises is a really good way of testing that understanding and sharing that knowledge. Past events help us learn, but can lead to bias. So, of course, nature is wonderfully complex, and we do tend to focus on trying to model or simulate past events, but it's very important that we remember that whatever happens next is most likely to be different again, and we must be flexible for that. The third point here is perhaps a little dry and boring, but I think really important. The development and maintenance of operational systems that are robust and quality assured is hard, and I feel often undervalued and overlooked. Just keeping everything turning over all the time so that we can respond, even if it's at 2 o'clock in the morning or on Christmas Day, is very important. And then my last point here, which I'll be really interested to hear what your thoughts and perspectives are, is around what actually should we be sharing. So often now we're getting asked to provide the raw data, but in an emergency, is that exactly actually what our customers need, or is it the expert interpretation of that data? So on that point, I'll end there and I'm hand over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks, Chris, for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm Amy Donovan from the University of Cambridge in the Geography Department. So I'm going to talk a bit about transboundary issues with warnings for volcanoes. I think this highlights quite a lot of the issues that have already come up in a slightly different way, in a slightly different frame. So we know that disasters cross borders all of the time. I've put up some examples there, not just volcanoes, but obviously also things like tsunami and floods. And so one of the challenges with that kind of scenario is how do you manage very different institutional contexts across the borders, different ways that governments approach warning, different ways that volcano observatories approach it, and different levels of responsibility. Different volcano observatories often have different remits or different responsibilities in terms of whether they just provide scientific information or whether they are charged with providing some form of advice. And that's very variable. The other challenge that borders provide is that you do find that populations have different levels of experience on different sides of the border. And I'm going to talk through an example from over 10 years ago now, the 2011 to 2012 eruption of Pujehue Coroncalle, which is a volcano in Chile. And the reason for picking that eruption, because there's many I could have picked, is that it was quite impactful, but particularly impactful in Argentina. And it also led to institutional changes and a binational agreement between Chile and Argentina, and the establishment of the observatory in Argentina as well. So this is Pujehue. These are just Landsat images showing the eruption. In Chile, it mostly just produced lava flows that didn't really go beyond the volcanic edifice, didn't really threaten anywhere. The ash plume, because of the dominant winds, almost always went straight into Argentina. and there were really very significant impacts within Argentina. So the town Villa Langostura had about 80 centimeters of ash fall over the duration of the eruption. It took down roofs, it polluted the water supplies, and in Argentina there was really very little awareness that this kind of thing could happen. So one of the people I spoke to said that his grandma said, well, it can't, that big black cloud that's coming over here, that's just a thunderstorm. Somebody would have told us if it was something else, because there was no warning in Argentina. The volcano, as you can see from the image, is entirely within Chile. The monitoring networks are entirely within Chile. And the Chilean Volcano Observatory comes under the sort of Interior Ministry, and so cannot share raw data with Argentina, because it's for sort of state secret type reasons or state security reasons. And that's something that I have encountered in other border volcanoes as well. It's very difficult to share the raw data between countries in a lot of contexts. They were sharing with SEGEMAR, for the Geological Survey, the sort of daily reports that the observatory produce. They produce a bulletin, they also have an alert level system. And it's quite well organised in Chile since 2008, when there was an eruption at Chaitén volcano, which led to a massive increase in resource for volcano monitoring. They went from monitoring 8 volcanoes in 2008 to monitoring 45 in 2013. So they had a huge investment because of what happened at Chaitén. And again, it's always reactive. These things with volcanoes, the investment is always after an eruption. And so Chile was producing these reports that were going to Buenos Aires, but Argentina, unlike Chile, is a federal system. It's state-led, the decisions are made at the municipal level, much less than the sort of Buenos Aires, which is 1,500 kilometers away from this region. Chile, very centralized. So people in Santiago were trying to call people in Buenos Aires who hadn't got a clue what was going on because it was being managed at the local level. So the sort of the differences, not only in the ways that volcano observatories operate, and there was none in Argentina at this point, but also in the structure of government and the ways that different countries anticipate other countries will be the same as they are when they're not, was a really big challenge in this eruption. The lack of any awareness in the population was another challenge. And the thing that that always happens in eruptions, and increasingly happens in the age of social media, is that information will travel across the border within the population, but it won't necessarily be the official information. So the Argentinians started to sort of pick up on the communications within Chile, and then that fed into what was already quite substantial distrust of the local governments. A lot of people said the government's trying to hide this eruption. They're trying to hide it because they want people to come from Buenos Aires to ski. It was the start of the ski season when this thing started erupting. So there were a lot of challenges at the local level within Argentina. And having very different populations and different groups within the population as well. There are the people who are running the tourist industry, but then there's also people who are just trying to survive. San Carlos de Bariloche, which is a big town in Rio Negro province, has a sort of, there's a posh bit which is in the centre, it looks like a sort of alpine village, and then there's a slum that's just behind the sort of ridge that you can't see. So there's very different needs within that population in terms of how they access information, and also the kind of information that they need. So I think a lot of the kinds of issues that come up in terms of the structure of how advice flows, information flows, are really illustrated by some of the differences between countries. Chile and Argentina now have a binational agreement around volcano monitoring, and some shared networks on some volcanoes, like Laguna de Maule is one, which is a sort of super volcano that goes across the border. And they are building capacity, but again, they are still under-resourced, particularly in Argentina. But also in Chile, they have a lot of resource for putting instruments down. They don't have enough people. So the sort of faint background you can see to the slides is Obdas, which is the volcano observatory of the Southern Andes. And they have all their monitoring data, it's all great, but it's manned essentially by students who are obviously rotating in and out and so on. So there's a lot of challenges just in the resourcing, as Andrew said earlier, that volcano observatories are typically not that well resourced. The other interesting thing between Chile and Argentina is the significant difference in the social contract, what people expect government to do for them, what people trust government to do for them as well. That attitudes to government are very different because of the recent sort of histories in both countries, which are really super interesting. But I'm not going to go into that now. And that means that they look to different sources for information. They don't know where to look some of the time, or they refuse to trust geologists. In Chile, there's a challenge with geologists because of mining. There's a lot of community suspicion around geology because of the mining industry. In Argentina, there's a long historical distrust of scientists as part of the elite. So that there's very different relationships between these two countries. And I think one of the key challenges, and one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting in the coming years, because things erupt in Chile quite frequently, is how much building relationships before these eruptions is going to have changed the systems. When something happens like Pujehue, next time will these new institutions in Argentina and a better flow of information change the way that it's responded to and the impacts that it has. And I've just illustrated a few other transborder volcanoes on the side there that are also very interesting, have very different experiences of warnings or lack thereof. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Frankie. Same as before, opening up questions to the floor and online. Do we have anyone who would like to kick us off? Chris.
Well, yes, please. I actually, there was a question about the aircraft, actually. Right at the very end of your talk, Francis, you mentioned there was a graphic showing how the requirements of engines to survive volcanic. I mean, how well is the aviation industry responding to this? I mean, are they actually getting proactive in thinking ahead about this, or does it remain slightly reactive in the sense they wait till something bad happens and then make a change?
So I should caveat my answer by saying that obviously I don't work for the aviation industry, so I can only give you the perspective from somebody working at a VAC. But certainly for us, I spent the day yesterday with someone from Rolls-Royce discussing this very topic about making sure that we understand the new work that they're doing and they're understanding our modelling.
Sorry. Hi, Frankie. I've got two questions for you, actually. My first one was, you mentioned that you're going to start looking at future eruptions, and I wonder what your what kind of forecast you're basing those on. You mentioned that you were just about to start a project. I don't know if you. But my second question as well is kind of linked to Chris's. Do you give advisories as a VAC to the maritime industry?
Oh, this is another, I'm sure Andrew would be much better placed than me to. The short answer for the maritime industry is no, unless Andrew would like to correct me that any other VACs are involved in this. Your question about future, so maybe, maybe wires crossed, or maybe I mispresented something, but perhaps was it around probabilistic forecasts? So that's something that, so don't forget we're always, we wait for an event, right? We're responding to an event that's happened. As a VAC, we're not predicting that something is going to happen. We're not predicting whether something's going to erupt. So, but one of our big projects at the moment is developing probabilistic forecasts. Have I clarified? Yes. So, so it's particularly around source terms. We're very much using databases of historical eruptions to think about the parameter space. So there's a big question there about how do you assign uncertainty in the first place.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry if I can take the liberty of commenting on both of those. So firstly, with the marine threat, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to scaffold off the marine threat and the existing aviation arrangements towards a more holistic approach to volcanic hazard engagement with the I'll say the global transport community. So ICAO, even in aviation, is quite effective and proactive, and really sort of sprang into operation after the Galunggung encounters in 1982. The marine, the international marine networks understand that there are volcanic hazards to shipping, but there hasn't been a very coordinated effort about, well, what do we do about that? I'm hoping that Hunga Tonga and other events would help crystallise some developments at UN level, but it's kind of a slow road, and maybe early warnings for all again is an opportunity. On the aviation one, so I used to work for the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. I used to manage the Darwin VAC. I am now independent, so I can just speak my mind. And I would say that AIR in 2010 was a case study of terribly reactive aviation industry behaviour, because prior to that, we had not been able to get any kind of indication from the engine manufacturers about what was safe for aviation, and we were being asked to give forecasts for an undefined hazard. Just, tell us ash of any concentration, and therefore that resulted in quite conservative and, as Frankie said, bespoke practices between the VACs about what are we trying to forecast here, and big polygons that extended over Siberia, etc., etc. And then suddenly there's a $1 billion pound crisis, and everyone has to cope, and rules get drawn up which were totally undefensible scientifically, but sort of allowed aviation traffic to happen. And then there was an engagement process with industry saying, well, okay, what are we going to come back to scientifically here? So if we were going to work proactively with industry, we'd want everything to be the other way around. But in the case of the aviation thing, it was an industry-led problem with us trying to find a solution. I think now things are much better following all the work, all the sort of crisis management that's happened since then. And now I'll shut up.
So I have a question. Actually, it's feel free, any four of you, to open this one up. We've heard about providing warnings or information to a variety of audiences. We've heard about talking to a public audience, to industry, the aviation industry, to emergency managers, and to other agencies, either within or across borders. My question to you is, how might the content of that warning or that information and the style or the platform that's communicated on vary depending on your intended audience? Quite broad.
I'm going to take this one because it's something I have been thinking for a while, and this is purely my opinion, just based on what more gut feeling. But I think it should be the same, because at the end of the day, the majority of the decision makers are likely to, in the case we're dealing in experience, they know as much as the public, as much as the emergency responders. So I think the type of information should be virtually the same, as understandable, honest, and transparent as possible scenarios. And but I don't think it should vary between the different groups if there is inexperience. I'm talking about the scenario that we were discussing for this session, like when people don't know and they haven't been through it. So that's my personal opinion. I don't know if anybody else.
So I thought this was actually quite a pertinent point, and it really made me reflect when we were preparing for this about how maybe I have a different perception because I'm dealing with the industry. So perhaps the difference is that, of course, we have some rules and regulations, and I'm given some guidance as to exactly what I have to work towards generating for our forecasts. One of the things that perhaps is familiar to all of us, though, is that even industry has a risk appetite, and there's always a person involved. And perhaps the one thing we started to comment on earlier, but perhaps we could expand a little bit now, is what happens if you give a false positive? So what happens if you tell industry or a local population that something's going to happen, that if they fly through the cloud, their engines are going to fail, and that doesn't happen, then you lose that trust as well. So, and I think that kind of speaks to some of the points that you two were both commenting on earlier.
I'll just throw my 2 cents in. I completely agree as well. It was my experience in doing this that actually even the decision makers in the governmental organisations have basically the same knowledge as the general public, and if you tried to tell them more technical information, they would understand it as much as the public would, which is not very much. And so I think when you're trying to tell people of a certain level of understanding, you need to understand that the government officials don't necessarily have a great level of understanding, even though they're in a position where they actually need to make a decision on this information. So I agree.
I also wanted to touch on something that someone said, which was that people tend to be conservative when there is uncertainty, and they what they do is just go to, you know, lots of losses, or in the case of aviation, or huge evacuation areas when they are not needed. In the case of sometimes things happening in the ground, it seems to occur sometimes. So you might have, as you were talking about, appetite for risk and how much they can take, and the interest, but I think it can go both ways. And my experience is also that in order to that failed sort of not, you know, they can be too conservative in their ways of reacting to this if they don't understand properly. So yes.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree as well. I think it's really important to be transparent with information. I think one of the interesting things is some eruptions that have gone on for a long time is that the public do learn as well. They get better and better at appreciating and understanding the uncertainty as time goes on. And one of the things that I think is really helpful is therefore sort of providing information during peacetime so that they can get used to the fact that there are earthquake forms, or there's a few little volcano-tectonic earthquakes every so often, and then they can start to understand what an increase looks like. I know the Icelandic Met Office have had the data on their website for a very long time, and there is quite a good trust of key sort of scientists and the people that they sort of get to know, to see, even in peacetime, just so that they build a relationship. The Geoscience Committee meets even in peacetime every 6 months, because again, you've got to build trust between those actors as well, the civil defence and the university and the Met Office. So I think that sort of long-term learning process is really, really important as well.
I was just going to do a minor touch on that, actually, because we touched on this when we were talking the other day about how, you know, people meeting in peacetime, whereas it's slightly different in a situation like Ecuador, where you have volcanoes erupting constantly. There is no peacetime. And so actually that way of communication and that kind of setup is actually kind of an evolving beast. Like, you know, things change as we realize, right, okay, we could do this better, but we're still doing whatever it was we didn't think was very good, and we have to figure out how to do it better while we're still kind of trying to provide the information. So it's two slightly different problems when you don't have peacetime, and you just kind of have to look. It's reactionary, but there is no way for it to not be reactionary, because there's no time when you're not trying to deal with something. So
I just wanted to add a comment that we kind of learned on the stakeholder communication side from St. Vincent. We surveyed the communities after the eruption happened about crisis communications, and also spoke to many of the stakeholders involved, the airports, the ministries and things. And actually, yeah, I would agree with you that the information is the same, but the communication needs to be slightly different in the fact that it needs to be two-way. So they very much need a forum to be able to have their questions answered in that moment in time. So it started as very much a one-way kind of thing with stakeholders, and that they needed to hear that information very rapidly on where the ash clouds were going and what was happening at the airport. You know, do they have to shut the airport? But then it became, okay, now I've got all this ash. What does that mean for my water supply systems and the electric grid? What should I be doing here and then? And that was when I think the most demand was kind of on Seismic, who were running the kind of crisis communications campaign, because they were getting WhatsApps left, right, and centre, because they hadn't got that facility in place to be able to kind of manage that side. So yeah, that's the main difference, I think, that it kind of becomes a bit more important for that dialogue, to facilitate the dialogue.
nothing on my
Oh,
question.
okay, fantastic. And then we'll come across to you.
A question from James Hickey online to the panel in general. Do you see benefits in volcanology of moving towards greater use of impact-based warnings? And if so, how might they be validated in the scenarios that the hazard manifests?
Please don't jump
So this is something I've thought about a little bit, watching the sort of drive generally towards impact-based forecasts. I think it's very challenging in volcanology because there are so many different types of impact. Because a volcanic eruption is always a multi-hazard event. There are lots of different ways in which those hazards can then impact different distances from the volcano, all of these kinds of things. And I don't know that we are yet at the position of having the technology and the models, particularly to do it convincingly. I don't know. I mean, Andrew might have a view on this, or Joe, because I know that I work with impact-based forecast quite a lot, but I think we would struggle at the moment because of the hazard models. The only thing I can sort of, the closest thing I can think of is the Explorers project way back in 2008 when they did some modelling around Vesuvius and some of the other decade volcanoes where they looked at the impact on buildings, pyroclastic flows, and there are people working quite, so people like Susanna Jenkins has been working a lot on impacts on buildings particularly. But I think given how much uncertainty there is around the hazards, moving on to impacts then just increases some of that uncertainty, I think, at the moment. But it's also something I think the community does need to start thinking about and learning from the Met community on that as well.
I was just going to comment perhaps from a very specific perspective. So for us, what that might look like is actually providing a dosage rather than a concentration. And to do that, we'd need a lot more information. We'd need to know flight paths. We'd need to know how much air, I believe, is injected into the engine, not an engineer, and what the impact then is. So that's a whole set of other information and understanding. And then I'd also, I think what also perhaps needs to come into this discussion is, well, then who's making the decisions? So you may have noticed that I chose my words very carefully earlier when introducing our role, which is to provide advice and guidance to the aviation industry.
Just a point, I think impact-based, it sometimes is difficult to add the time dimension, and that's something that maybe, I mean, it can be included, but adds so much complexity that maybe it defeats the purpose of trying to make something easy to understand. In some occasions, obviously, it depends on some situations.
And we had a question just there.
Hi, I'm Paulina. I'm a master's student from IRDR. I wanted to ask about tourism because volcanic sites are obviously very attractive for tourists. So what kind of things, different things do we have to consider there in terms of risk communication? I recently did my master's thesis kind of interviewing park rangers in Iceland on their volcanic risk perceptions and their role in local hazard preparedness, and a lot of them said that the kind of perceptions of tourists and domestic people in Iceland are quite different. So what kind of things should we be considering there? And then something else that I was thinking about as well is hazards are obviously very different. So what about hazards that aren't, you know, per se so explosive, but more pervasive, like toxic gases that are always there and pose a risk to the community and to tourists alike? Thank you.
I'd do some minor comments on that. I think it's very difficult, and I think the communication strategy has to be different because the lines of communication you have with local people will not work for tourists. They don't have phones that work in the country. They don't necessarily listen to local media or the news. And so that is something that is extremely difficult. And unless you've got kind of the rest of the tourist industry being kind of the hosts of that, being on the ball and realizing that the tourists aren't getting the information, it is extremely difficult. It's also massively impactful actually when the volcanoes become more active, because that in turn then actually keeps tourists away, which for a lot of places around volcanoes where they rely on the tourist industry for their income, it's massively a problem, especially when you have governments saying, no, we're keeping people away from this area, and the locals are being like, well, no, this is our income. And so how you balance kind of the idea of having people close to dangerous activities versus the locals not being able to make money is still something that is not, people don't know. It's kind of on an ad hoc basis that at the moment, especially in Ecuador, that is managed. And it became a massive issue with Cotopaxi volcano in 2015, where one of the biggest kind of money earners for the local people were guides that climbed to the summit with people, and the summit was closed off for obvious reasons. But after the volcano became at least superficially less active, they were still not allowed back to the summit, and there was some quite heated kind of discussions going on about why they should be allowed to continue making money. And they didn't quite understand kind of the risks associated even when the volcano appeared to be quiet. So it is really difficult. In terms of the gases comment, that's probably something that's even more difficult because it's not often visible. There are a lot of craters and places you can go in Ecuador where you can go and see fumaroles, and you can go and see places where gases are coming out of the ground. And most of them are signposted by the scientists saying, please do not go into this area, it's extremely dangerous. And the tourists walk straight past the signs no matter what you do. So it is extremely difficult, and I don't think there's an answer to that yet.
Sorry, I'm going to touch on the language aspect, and I come from Tenerife, from the Canary Islands, and you have tourists from all around the world. So during the 2011 emergency, which was a submarine eruption that at the end didn't, well, it was an eruption, but it wasn't so aerial, and it changes completely the perception. But they were discussing, because before they knew where the eruption was going to happen, they wanted to communicate in different languages, and also the capacity when you're quite stretched, having to try to release regular some sort of information in English, French, obviously Spanish, sometimes Italian, German. So that's already quite difficult. Interestingly, in the Canary Islands as well, the emergencies, the ambulance service, so the medical services do have a multi-language, because all the tourists, one of the accidents that happened, they have a multi-language system in which they always have a translator that will speak a couple of languages and will be able to communicate with those tourists. So the language aspect already is is an interesting one that needs to be considered. And then obviously volcanoes are going to attract, as well as, some people are going to say, oh my goodness, I'm not going to there with a volcano. And some people will say, oh wow, I'm definitely going there. So that's also managing both things, what's going to be negative and positive, and the management. So yeah, there's lots of consideration, and a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think the other element of that is the sort of land use planning side of it, and the way that certainly in Latin America there's been a bit of an explosion of tourist industry on volcanoes. So you've got ski industry, but you've also got geoparks being set up all over the place involving volcanoes, and essentially attracting people who don't know anything about the risk to visit the volcanoes, and a lot of therefore pressure on observatories to have policies in place, or to have protocols in place for managing the geopark side of things, as well as all the normal kind of stuff that they have to do. So I do think that there's a sort of a challenge there for governments in giving permissions for these sorts of things as well, because it's a huge economic consideration, and people make lots of money out of it. I know in Iceland in 2014-15, when there was the Hurricane eruption, for example, the gas levels were too high to allow people to go in, and there was a big breakdown of trust between the civil defence and the tourist companies, because the tourist companies were like, well, this is one of the areas we want to take people into. We always take them in anyway when there's not an eruption, and we know from Eyjafjallajökull we could make a lot of money from these things. And then there's the recent Fagradalsfjall eruption, where they have been able to make lots of money out of it because it's more accessible, and people do want to visit erupting volcanoes. So you've got a hazard that is also a tourist attraction, and that is a long-term problem as well as a short-term one. I think Iceland have got on top of it pretty well, but in some ways they have a slightly easier, less populated country to deal with than some of the Latin American ones.
I think not only that, but their volcanoes tend to erupt in a way that might not necessarily be a danger to people, whereas you really couldn't do that in sort of Latin America for the most part, where you've got the big andesitic stratovolcanoes that you can't get anywhere near, basically, for safety reasons. So I think, yeah,
you shouldn't.
Hi, my name is Penelope Wilson. I'm just started at UCL, but I've previously been at Kingston University running our undergraduate hazards program, and I'm actively doing research on sort of looking at geotourism and actually the hazards and public risk perception and stakeholder risk perception of all of those things, because it's not just volcanoes, it's all things. It's people just even going for a walk along the beach, as we know from all of the landslides that have happened this summer. And then people wanting to go back to those active landslides to go and look for fossil hunting and things. And I think it is really important to actually understand, the public's understanding of risk related to so many geotourism activities that we actually have. I think, as was proven with White Island, you had a lot of people just thinking, oh, there's a volcano, this is cool, I want to go to it. And now, unfortunately, there were big impacts from that. And stakeholders themselves actually need to be more invested in providing the right kind of information to the public, so that the public at least are responsible for taking on that risk. They are actually aware when they embark on something how much risk they're taking on, because the stakeholders are now obviously in lawsuits, and so they need to be invested in this as well, really. And I think it's the whole kind of risk table, isn't it? It's understanding that the probability could be low. I might go and see an active volcano, or the probability might be at sort of 2, but actually if it does erupt and I'm suddenly trapped on an island, the impact to me could be that I'm going to die, and so it's huge. So I think this is a really important area that actually does need looking into, and along with my colleague who's somewhere in the building, I think Kevin, we've got a questionnaire that we're sort of hoping to get quite globally to actually start looking at that risk perception as well. And signs are really important. Why do people ignore signs? Because the signs are there. Stay on the boardwalk, and people will walk off the boardwalk, or decide that oh, actually I want to go skinny dipping in that that hotspot instead. And I think it's really important to start to understand actually what the public are thinking.
I think that's a really good point, but I think you also need to add on to that the fact that things like tour companies that stand to make money from people coming are probably, if they stand to make a lot of money, willing to downplay the risk that they may understand as being a big risk, but if they stand to make a lot of money, they're going to lower that threshold of what is an acceptable risk, and no matter how well you educate the public, they may, there's never going to be that full understanding there. So I think there has to be a responsibility on that side of it as well, because money is a great motivator, and sometimes in the wrong direction.
This is where you maybe need to think about whether things need more legislation in this area.
I think with Sally sitting in here, I think there's going to be a before and after Fakari or White Island, and I think that's going to. I mean, I'm not putting you the spotlight, but you know much more than me about it. What I want to say is that I think that's going to be a case that is going to set up or make proper changes into that industry, especially on volcanoes that are very dangerous. I don't want to say more because we have the expert in here. So.
All right, so I'm very conscious that this is standing now between you and lunch. I just want to thank everybody for a really productive discussion. I want to thank our panel for sharing their insights and their experiences. And I think basically what I'm taking away from this is very much what translates between hazards is the need for really building those relationships, involving local communities and whoever the impacted groups are in all stages of the planning and the information workflow, and yeah, building those trusts and how people would like to receive their information. So thank you everyone, and yeah, a round of applause for our panel, please.